Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are coming up on Trinity Sunday, this coming Sunday. Today, we are actually departing from the lectionary and looking at the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and the first few verses of Genesis chapter 2. Before we get there, let's start with the first of the three P's, and this is a prayer for Trinity Sunday. Author, word, and translator, we invite you to dwell with us, to form us, and to challenge us. Send a fresh wind to enliven our hearts, minds, and spirits to your word and your truth. Let our worship expand our hopes and our convictions and bring you glory. Make us instruments playing our part of the harmonious song of your love in the world. Amen. Second P is perspective. And again, we're coming up on Trinity Sunday, this coming Sunday on the church calendar. And I thought it might be cool to return to and expand on a Bible study I did a long time ago on Genesis chapter 1, the creation story. The creation story, when read through the lens of the New Testament, involves the entire Trinity. The Father creates through the Word, the Son who speaks, and through the Spirit who hovers over the waters of chaos. And out of those waters of chaos, God brings order and beauty. There are both structural and aesthetic features of the creation story in Genesis chapter 1. So it's both structural and also artistic. And that's what I'm going to talk about in just a bit. Now, I have proposed before that we can read the creation story in Genesis alongside the work of an art critic named Annette Michelson, and she gave a talk at the Guggenheim Museum in 1969. She talked about the relationship between structure and art. By structure, Michelson was referring specifically to the early 20th century thought system called structuralism, which was all the rage in several fields like linguistics, philosophy, history, and anthropology. Talks about an underlying structure that unites human experience and also cultural production, regardless of human context. Michelson saw a tension emerge when this method, structuralism, was tried to be applied to art. Because art, she said, resists the notion of any authority, model, or structure in a very stubborn way. Put bluntly, art as human expression resists structure. And yet, of course, there is structure in art. You can see structure in dance, music, painting, sculpture, filmmaking, etc. But what Michelson was getting at is that artistic expression involves emotion. And it's important to pay attention to the encounter one has with a work of art, which is different from focusing on the structure that produced the art. So she called it in her talk, the nakedness of art's presence. Now, I see an analogy here to biblical interpretation. So a structural reading of a text would focus on things like language, audience, author, historical context, the literary qualities of a biblical text. It's a more analytical way to read the Bible. But an aesthetic reading of a text focuses on the encounter we as readers can have with a biblical text as a work of art and source of inspiration. So we can ask a question like, what emotions well up inside us as we read this story or this text? What does it inspire within us? And reading the Bible in this way focuses on its living quality. The same spirit that breathed through the biblical writers and editors is the same spirit that flows through us as we read. They were inspired when they wrote and edited. We can be inspired as we read and study. Now, we can certainly read the Bible for historical cues. We can read it for details that might aid archaeological digging. We can read it for evidence about the development of language, ethics, and theology. This is an analytical way of reading the Bible. It's reading it along the lines of the scholar. But the Bible is also a text of spirit, like a piece of art. The books of the Bible are like pieces of art in a gallery. Each book or painting, so to speak, is a unique expression of inspired human creativity that, just like an inspiring piece of art, can inspire our spirits. So we can see both structural and also aesthetic features in the creation story in Genesis chapter 1. And that brings us to the third of the three P's. And we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through chapter 2, verse 4. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth, and that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Okay, so you can hear the rhythm in the text as I read it. The rhythm provides the structure of the text. But the story is also a lyrical work of art. The late Walter Brueggemann, biblical scholar, calls this story in Genesis a mini epic and a hymn, a lyrical work of art. So the rhythm and the hymnic style provide the structure and the aesthetic quality of the text. And I want to begin there with the aesthetic quality of the text. So listen to the first three verses in the Jewish Publication Society's translation, and you get a sense of this text's lyrical, artistic quality in this translation. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Smooth, right? The language kind of carries you along, almost in a poetic sense, even though, strictly speaking, this story isn't written in Hebrew poetry. It's written in historical prose, but it's a kind of poetic prose. And notice in verses 1 and 2 that earth is described as being formless, void, and dark. It's mythic language. And when it's coupled with a reference to the surface of the deep and also the concept of water, it carries the sense of chaos. So it's out of the chaos that God brings order. And this order begins with light, the first thing God creates. And notice also that God doesn't create out of nothing in this story. There is something, it's just a kind of chaotic mess. Now, there's a long tradition in Christian theology that says God created ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, this is more of a theological statement than it is an exegetical one. In other words, the concept of ex nihilo isn't derived from the text itself, but it's derived from a theological notion that God is the prime and first mover of all things, and that there was nothing before God and nothing that exists alongside God. So God was there at the beginning. So theologically, this is a correct statement, but it's imported into the story and not derived from the story, because in the story itself, something is there that God creates out of. In this story, the emphasis is on God bringing order out of chaos, a bit like a potter taking a shapeless mass of clay, spinning the wheel, and creating a beautiful work of art. So, God in the story is the artist or potter who creates beauty. Now, continuing with the aesthetic quality of the text, notice the repetition of phrases throughout, which enhances the poetic beauty of the story. So, in verses 3, 6, 9, 11, 14, 20, 24, 26, 28, and 29, there is the repetition of the phrase, God said. So, creation happens through the word of God, which, again, when read through the lens of the Trinity for Trinity Sunday, it implies that the first two persons of the Trinity are engaged in this process as the Spirit is hovering over all things and ultimately filling all things. The breath of life is what the Spirit is called in this text. In verses 4, 10, 12, 18, 21, 25, and 31, there's the repetition of the phrase, God saw that it was good. So God speaks and then God sees that it was good, speaking creation into existence and then looking with delight at the work of art taking shape. More poetic repetition. In verses 4, 7, 14, and 18, God separates things in order to create. In verses 5, 8, and 10, God names things. In verses 7, 9, 11, 15, 24, and 30, there's the repetition of the phrase, and it was so. And then in verses 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31, there's a repetition of the phrase, and there was evening and morning. So the story is a lyrical work of art that describes God, the artist, creating a work of art. So the feature of the story itself communicates what God is up to. It's an artistic story, and God is an artist. Now for the structural features of the story, and they connect a bit with the artistic ones. So the poetry and rhythm create a structure in the story. Each time we read the phrase God said, it's followed by the phrase, and it was so. God's word creates. It's a structural feature of the story. Each time we read the phrase, God saw, it's followed structurally by the phrase, it was good. Also, throughout the story, God separates things in order to create, which is another structural feature, even as it's also poetic, as I mentioned a second ago. And the same holds true for the repetition of the phrase, there was evening and there was morning. It's a structural feature of the story, but it's also artistic. Now, this is not the language of history, it's the language of poetry and art, which means the creation story is not a literal recounting of the creation of the universe and world in 6 24-hour days. And we know this because of another structural feature of the story. It's called the framework hypothesis, and it describes the structure of the days. So the days in the creation story are not chronological, they're structural. And we know this because in days 1 through 3, God creates spheres. And in days 4 through 6, God fills those spheres. And if you don't read it this way, then you have this awkward issue of how to explain the days and the nights. How are these even happening when the sun and the moon aren't created until day 4? So you can't have 6 literal days here. So instead of reading the days as chronological, the framework hypothesis says we can line them up next to each other. So day 1 matches day 4, day 2 matches day 5, day 3 matches day 6, and day 7 is the crown. It's the special Sabbath day of rest. So again, days 1 through 3 are spheres, and days 4 through 6 are the specific things that fill each of those spheres. So here's what this looks like. So on day 1, verses 3 to 5, God creates the spheres of day and night. It matches with day 4 in verses 14 through 19, where God creates the celestial bodies that fill the spheres of day and night. Day 2, verses 6 to 8, God creates the spheres of water and sky. Day 5 is where it matches, verses 20 to 23. God creates the things that fill the spheres of waters and skies. Day 3, verses 9 through 13, God creates the sphere of dry land. God fills that sphere in day 6, verses 24 through 31, animals and humans. So you see how this works. Days 1 through 3 are the spheres. Days 4 through 6 match those spheres and fill them. And the capstone on the whole thing is day 7, the Sabbath day, when God rests. Now, when we read the creation story in this way, we get around these stupid debates that Christians have had over how you can believe in evolution by natural selection when Genesis 1 talks about 6 literal days of creation. Genesis 1 doesn't talk about 6 literal days of creation. Genesis 1 is a lyrical work of art with structural features that enhance the beauty of the story. Now, all of this raises the question of what the story means. Well, obviously, it means God is the creator. That's the most obvious meaning. But then there are a series of other things that I think the story means. So first, it's a story of God bringing beauty out of the things that are shadowy and chaotic. A beautiful work of art from a lump of clay, so to speak. This is something God continues to do in our daily lives and throughout the world. And we can see God at work if we have the eyes of faith. So we can see around us constantly beauty being brought out of chaos or order out of chaos. Second, the story is in a way also a promise. It's a foundational story in our faith tradition, which tells us where God's heart is at with respect to the world. God sees our world as originally good. God saw that it was good over and over, is repeated in the story. And then at the capstone, God saw that it was very good. So this means, as Richard Rohr has said, that we ourselves as humans are originally good. Goodness is our natural state. And it's so important to keep reminding ourselves of this, especially as we look across the world and see a lot of bad things. Third, God divides in order to create. God separates things in order to create. And it's an image of God creating diversity. It's not full unity. God divides and separates in order to create. So when the prophet Ezekiel sees God early on in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel sees a rainbow. It's a whirl of color and diversity. So if that's who God is, then of course we should expect to see God creating diversity in the creation story itself, which is exactly what we do see. And finally, tying all of this back into Trinity Sunday, God creates human beings in God's own image in this story. So in verse 26, God says, "Let us make humans in our image." There is plurality in God, which is kind of an elliptical way to get there, but there is a connection there with the Christian notion of the Trinity. One God, three persons. And in verse 27, God creates humankind, male and female. God creates humankind in the divine image, which means that both genders, all genders, are in God's image. So every person has inherent dignity because of this. All of us, each one of us, is created in God's very image. And because of that, each one of us is precious. And so this leads to a natural ethical question for all of us. How can we affirm the dignity of every human being and also of all creation? How can we do this? It's a question that we need to constantly keep in our minds every time we encounter another human being in the world. We should see them as another divine image bearer. More to come in this coming Sunday's sermon.